Kyrgyzstan. And I'm delighted to see how many people braved the weather this evening to find out where Kyrgyzstan is. The ambassador was good enough to allow all of you to see its centrality in the Asian continent by means of the map here. The Bush administration has made the war on terrorism its centerpiece. And the participants along with us in that war are many, and many small states like Kyrgyzstan. I think it's a fascinating question as to how these individual states are woven into a larger fabric. And of course, until the very recent past, Central Asia was not on the radar screen of many Americans. With the breakup of the former Soviet Union, our attention moved there to some extent. And with energy questions arising, we certainly had more attention. And now with the war on terrorism and our actions in Afghanistan, it becomes a centerpiece of our attention. So we're absolutely delighted to be joined by our ambassador to Kyrgyzstan to discuss U.S. Central Asia relationships and the role of Kyrgyzstan in the war on terrorism. Ambassador O'Keefe, as I mentioned, is a native of Baltimore. He received his Bachelor of Science degree in Business Administration from Loyola College. Now, last time when I mentioned that John Duke Anthony was from BMI, there was raucous applause. The Loyola people here are much more sedate, I notice. His Master of Public Administration degree is from Harvard University. You needn't applause. In the State Department, he's been posted to the former Yugoslavia, to Norway, to the Philippines, and to Russia. He's had 2 tours of duty, along with his wife, who is also a member of the State Department, now posted to Kazakhstan. They've been together in 2 assignments in Russia and 2 in the former Yugoslavia as well. I should note that while in those postings, the ambassador was very active in the international schools, serving on their boards in Manila and in Belgrade and in Moscow. He's not only been posted to those countries, but he's been in the office of the Undersecretary of State for Management. He's been in the Bureau of European Affairs. He's had a series of interesting responsibilities in the area of security in both of those postings. But now, of course, he's in Kazakhstan as our ambassador. The questions of Central Asia and the questions of terrorism are fascinating. We've chatted a bit before the meeting began, and I'm looking forward to his remarks with a great deal of interest. It's my enormous pleasure to present our ambassador to Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan. Mrs. O'Keefe doesn't know how clairvoyant I am. Ambassador John O'Keefe.
Thank you very much, Dr. Byrd. It's both a privilege and a delight to have this invitation from you to speak tonight. I had mentioned to Dr. Byrd that when I received the assignment to be ambassador to the Kyrgyz Republic, I did look at a map. And for that reason, tonight I have a few maps to show you. Just in preference, as a preface to when we start, I've also included about 15 photos of the Kyrgyz Republic because I think terrain and geography have a lot to do with what's going on there. And it's about 90% mountains, quite poor, 5 million people, poverty rate above 50%, average annual income $232. So you can see that this is the kind of place where poverty, ignorance, and inability of the government to deliver services can have a deleterious effect, especially in terms of building a base where people may turn to extremism to solve their problems. As you see right there, Central Asia really is in Central Asia, and Kyrgyzstan is right there in the middle of Central Asia. Can we have the next slide, please? It's down bordering China. Right below it is Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, huge country, great oil deposits. Uzbekistan really is a key country in the regions, 25 million, has always been culturally in the lead in the various khanates that were there. Turkmenistan, fairly sparsely populated, but with enormous gas reserves, and a leader, Niyazov, who is a little odd, to say the least. Next slide, please. And this is a blow-up of the Kyrgyz Republic. I will just mention one thing, and I'm supposed to stay in the spotlight here, but over here in this area is the Fergana Valley. There are 10 million people in that valley. There's 3 sovereign nations that control part of its territory. It had always been united before the conquest by the Russians in a khanate. And it's the home of, among other people, Babur the Great, who was the fellow who conquered India. He was the first Mughal emperor of India, and he was born there and was thrown out by his brother, and then went off to bigger and better things. Next slide, please. These are, we'll just run through these very quickly. Downtown Bishkek, and that's the president's office right there. Again, downtown Bishkek. Coca-Cola is there, only the umbrella, she doesn't have the product. A couple of Kyrgyz, and this gives you an idea. It's a pretty rough life that they have. This is typical Kyrgyz handicraft. It's felt, and they pound it and make it into various designs. Next. These are sheep coming across a river. They're primarily engaged in sheep and cattle raising, some agriculture. This is a yurt. It's a round tent made of felt, and they tote those up to the high pastures in the summer, and they live in them. They really actually live in them. Next, please. Rural road. This is an aerial shot of Lake Issyk, 130 miles long, 60 miles wide, 2,000 feet deep. Quite a beautiful place with a lovely climate. And that's sunset over the lake. Back one. Oh, next one. It's okay. These are petroglyphs. They're all over the place, especially around the lake. We could go on to the next one. This is a typical valley, and there'll be a number of valley shots. You can see it's pretty rough, pretty lonely, a lot of uninhabited areas, and a lot of mountains, a lot of 7,000-meter peaks. That's 21,000 feet. It's spectacularly beautiful, and the people are very, very friendly. So let me just begin with the presentation, now that you have kind of a feel for both the beauty and the I don't want to say poverty, but certainly lack of resources in the country. Next slide, please. In the 19th century, and this is a map from the 19th century, we had empire building. Russians were moving into Central Asia, taking over. The Brits controlled India, what is now India, and Pakistan, and sometimes Afghanistan, but not very often or very well. And basically, it was a game that was all about territory and was zero-sum. So what the Russians had, the Brits didn't have. French, Germans were pretty much in minor roles. They did a lot of archaeological work, but basically they had no base from which to expand their territories. And China was the country that kept on losing territory. In fact, about half of Kyrgyzstan used to be part of China. And in fact, one of the great Chinese poets, I think from the 3rd century, was born not far from the Kyrgyz capital of Bishkek. Next slide, please. The new game is quite different. First of all, it's not about territory. It's about influence. And it was played in one way before 9/11, because basically for us, Central Asia was energy, and energy was Kazakhstan. 4 or 5 billion barrels of reserves. Turkmenistan with a lot of gas reserves, but it really wasn't too easy to do business there. But our interest was seeing energy exported. And when you see John Wolfe in 2 weeks' time, one of his jobs was try to get that alternate pipeline built out of Kazakhstan down from Azerbaijan through Turkey. Since 9/11, it's shifted quite a bit, and I'll go into that in a minute or two. The EU and Japan, their interests are much less because both we and the Russians and the Chinese to a lesser extent, yes, there were commercial interests, but there were some other ideological and from our point, principled interests that we had in terms of democracy and civil society. For the European Union, through the OSCE, they, of course, supported a lot of the human dimension issues. But basically, the EU also was interested in commercial activity, interested in energy development. Japan also. And curiously enough, the country that has been very, very active has been Korea. They have an auto plant in Uzbekistan, and if you go into any of the stores, you will see mostly Korean electronic equipment. Again, the difference between the old great game and the new great game, these sovereign states really can and do influence what goes on. In the old days, the Tsar's armies simply rolled in, threw the Khans out, and put in their own governors. The Soviet Union, in the same sense, had the party mechanism to control all those territories. First secretary was always an Uzbek, if it was Uzbekistan, a Kyrgyz, if it was Kyrgyzstan. But the number two was always a Russian or a Ukrainian, a Slav. Nowadays, the countries are pretty much, leadership is pretty much whatever the major ethnicity is. And in terms of dealing with us and dealing with the Russians, dealing with the Chinese, they're quite independent in many ways. The leader of Turkmenistan has what I would call an aggressive neutrality, and he just won't cooperate with anybody saying he's neutral. And that includes the Iranians, it includes us, it includes the Russians, it includes his neighbors. Next slide, please. Now, when 9/11 happened, of course, Afghanistan, which you can see is about 130 miles south of Kyrgyzstan. The Kyrgyz were very interested in supporting us on this. I remember vividly, I was with my son, and we were up in Narin province, which was about a 3.5-hour drive from the capital, very, very high plateau. And as soon as I got back into town, the president called me and he said, "Whatever you want, please tell President Bush that we are willing to assist you in any way you want." Now, I think a lot of ambassadors got those kinds of calls where countries are so shocked that they were willing to immediately extend the hand of assistance. Now, what we did find was that there were varying degrees of how much they really meant it. And we decided that the best points of deployment to conduct the operations in Afghanistan would be out of Pakistan and out of Karshi-Khanabad in southern Uzbekistan. It didn't work out so well. There were limitations on what could be done out of Uzbekistan. No combat operations could be conducted from there. So General Franks sent out a group to take a look at bases in the region, headed by a Turkish general. The number two was Dutch. So you could see it was a real coalition that was functioning here. So they went to Tajikistan, they went to Kyrgyzstan, they went to Kazakhstan. And none of the places had adequate infrastructure that were shown. And the Kyrgyz say, "Take our military base, please use it." It couldn't handle the fuel and it couldn't handle the weight of the airplanes. But they said, could we, the general said, could we take a look at the commercial airports, the international airport? So I asked the Minister of Transport, and he said, "Oh, sure, go ahead." and decided that was the one. So we presented this in December to President Akayev, and his answer was yes. And it required an agreement, a treaty from their viewpoint, from our viewpoint, an agreement, and they had to get parliamentary approval, 2 houses of parliament. He personally presented the agreement to both houses of parliament, went and lobbied to make sure it got passed, because the communists, which didn't have many seats in parliament, but they had a faction. They didn't like it, and the nationalists, who represented a more conservative Muslim constituency in the South, didn't want it either. He pushed it through, and we got it. And one of the things that I found interesting in this is that this looked like it just kind of happened, but behind the scenes, what went on were a lot of conversations between and among the leaders of the region, but especially between the president of the Kyrgyz Republic and President Putin. President Akayev, when we were discussing this, he said, you know, I discussed this with President Putin. And I said, well, what did he say? And he said, you have to do what's best for your country. He said, but I don't have any objection to this. And what you're talking about is a shift, a profound shift, really, from traditional policies coming out of Russia. It really showed that Putin sees the fight against terrorism and the operation in Afghanistan as something that is in his country's interest as well. Could I have the next slide, please? I just want to give you a comparison of what happened before and after 9/11 with the Kyrgyz Republic and the Russian and the relations with Russia. Now, let me use a kind of an awkward example, but it's sort of like a young lady who doesn't have any boyfriends, and then suddenly a boyfriend shows up, and then everybody else gets interested. And in a way, it happened that way because we said we're really interested, and suddenly Russia and China got much more interested in what was what was going on. So before, the Russians would use debt, and let me just, I don't want to take, I know time is very short here. This debt was from 1991 and 1992 when Kyrgyzstan was in the ruble zone, and basically what it was accounts payable to Russian firms who shipped goods into Kyrgyzstan that they didn't need. But the Kyrgyz Republic, because they were weak and because Russia was a lot stronger, said, okay, we'll assume this as sovereign debt. In other words, it's state debt. And so we owe your treasury this much money. And they never had enough money to pay it. So what would happen is the interest would accumulate. And the Russians said, only pay us half the interest and we'll just add it on. So it started out about 180 and it bumped up to maybe 285 or $300 million. GDP of 1.5 billion. So this is a burden. And it's like dealing with a moneylender, with a loan shark. You never pay back. And they never could pay back. And the Russians would use this debt for various political reasons. Also, there was a tendency, big brother, little brother, the way Moscow, the center, used to deal with the provinces. And that pattern continued. And there was also certain condensation that you would see, and certainly how some Russian officials dealt with their counterparts. After, there was a real reaction, and there were two kinds of reactions. The first was the power ministries, Ministry of Defense, the FSB, Ministry of Interior. The leadership and the senior generals in those organizations did not like us being there. They did not like it. And what happened in February, we deployed in December. In February, they started putting in articles, planting articles in the local newspaper, just saying what awful things the troops from the base were doing. It was about half Americans, French, Australians, Koreans, Italians, Spanish. And stories which were frankly not true. And to give you a real kind of textual example, two of our security guys from the base were driving down a very dark road at night, icy conditions, and two pedestrians were walking in the middle of the road, and they hit them, two young women. And they were seriously hurt. Our doctors from the base came in, offered to treat. We paid all the treatment costs. We gave the family compensation. But a few days later, a fellow from the Russian embassy with a journalist shows up to the mother of one of the victims and says, we want you to why don't you tell this journalist how terrible the Americans are? And she said, no, they treated us very nice. They took care of my daughter. They gave us compensation. And so the guy says, well, you don't really think they should be there? And she said, oh, no, they should be there. They got rid of the terrorists. This is good. This is a good thing that they're here. So after that event, they kind of backed off, and they didn't do it anymore. So it's a kind of a funny reaction. But the other thing that happened was there were more high-level visits in this first half of 2002 from those power ministries than they must have had twice as many visitors in 6 months as they had in 3 years. So it's a great, great intensification of interests. Next slide, please. For China, a much different approach. And I'll mention a story I just read the other day. When Kissinger was opening up China, obviously he had a lot of conversations with Zhou Enlai, and they would discuss, I guess in Kissinger's professorial style, views about great events. And so he asked Zhou, what'd you think of the French Revolution? And he thought for a minute and he said, too early to tell. So the Chinese they're not rushing into anything. But what they did do, they really stepped up both their military and economic aid. They have started major economic projects with the Kyrgyz. They have invited the president of the Kyrgyz Republic, state visit, state dinner up there with Zhang Jimin. And at the dinner, it was just the chairman and the president together. And since the chairman speaks Russian, they didn't need a translator. And part of the conversation was, so what do you think about the coalition? And his response, the chairman's response was, it's a good thing. We don't oppose it. So you start looking at this great game, and I think if you look at the senior leadership of Russia and China, they see common interests. That what we want and what they want is very, very much the same. And what it is that we want is, I mean, clearly it's against terrorism, but what's at the heart of this? The heart of this is stability of the country. And I think our Chinese and Russian colleagues look more towards the security side, the military, the police, for want of a better word, the secret police, who work against terrorist cells, work against any of those kinds of threats. Our view is that stability includes those things, but you need jobs, you need economic development, and you need a government that the citizens have some confidence in. Have the next slide, please. Again, this is just a quick example of how we changed our policy. This debt was going to take up to 40% of the budget of the country. They weren't paying the teachers, they weren't paying their soldiers, they weren't paying their police. This is very risky business. And so in order to take that burden off of them, they needed to get restructuring at the Paris Club. And our government was a little slow, took a couple months for them to be convinced. Once we were convinced, the problem was we didn't hold any debt. And so we had to get the major holders. Russia was the major one, but Germany and Japan also were. And we had to convince them to restructure. So we finally did it in November of 2001. They said, okay, this is the way it's going to go. March of 2002, final meeting. It's a 3.5-year postponement of interest and a lot of money from the IMF. But then the Russians, once you do the Paris Club, you have to negotiate with each country on exactly how it's going to work. And the Russians stalled. They wouldn't come to an agreement until December, when Putin came to visit a month ago. And they finally signed the agreement. So why did they do it? It's because even though the leadership of any particular country, and we see it with our own country, has a particular policy, it's very hard to get the bureaucracy to follow. And we see that time and again when both we and the Russians and the Chinese, to a lesser extent, are dealing in Kyrgyzstan, where you know that the leadership wants one thing, but the guys on the ground, the guys in the ministry, are not following the leadership. Next slide. Now, again, Kyrgyzstan in the middle. If you're 5 million, you have an army of 12,000. You've been invaded twice by the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan. You're fairly weak. You have 1 billion some on your border from China. You have neighbors that don't like you and are making claims on your territory. So how do you play your foreign policy? Well, what they do, they're friends with everybody. And so we're there we've got about 1,800 right now from 8 different countries. But they also have established the Collective Security Agreement Anti-Terrorist Center. That's the 6 countries of Belarus, Russia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Armenia. Doesn't quite fit the map, but they're there. They also have put in the Regional Terrorism Anti-Terrorist Center of the Shanghai Cooperation. And that's China, Russia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan. So there's all these funny little groups, and everybody's got their own anti-terrorism group in the town. And it's very interesting to watch how they join everything. They'll join everybody's club, and they let everybody in. But you got to do it if you want to stay viable. Next slide. So we had Afghanistan, which in essence was a stateless country where Al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations could train, could plan, could put together their plans for terrorist acts. In Central Asia, you don't have that. Tajikistan, the president and the government doesn't control all the territory, but they control a lot more than they used to. And the real problem when you're dealing with terrorism is if the state doesn't control the territory, then terrorists will come in and set up. And they won't set up to do things there necessarily. They want to set up so they can plan to do things against us or against other coalition members. And the real problem is that there are varying degrees of authoritarianism. And, if you have an authoritarian government, Joe Stalin had a very controlled government. So yes, you can control, but I think because information flows so easily across borders now, that you will have people react. And so in Turkmenistan, the Turkmenbashi, who's the president, that's what he calls himself, there was an assassination attempt on him in December, and it was a real one. When I heard about it first, I thought it might have been staged, but no, they really try to bump him off. And that's what's going to happen in these places. The more people they throw in jail, the more they repress, I think the more they're going to build people who are going to try to do them in. And that is a very big danger for us. The other problem is that, as I said before, poverty, unemployment, and ignorance are the things that will drive folks into the arms of fundamentalist leaders. This region has 50 million people and a lot of potential for growth, and they won't cooperate one iota with one another on common economic interests. They can't even share the water properly. And so that is going to be a big problem. And we and the World Bank and the IMF are all pressing for some sort of cooperation. And frankly, I think they're trying themselves, but it's hard to let go of the old style where if you give up something, you show weakness. And none of them, it's all new countries and all new presidents, necessarily want to show any weakness. Ethnic fault zones. As I mentioned, that Fergana Valley, 10 million people, mostly Uzbeks, but there are a bunch of Kyrgyz, a lot of Tajiks, and then some other smaller groups. 1991, ethnic riots, 300 to 500 killed, mostly Kyrgyz killing Uzbeks. It could happen again. There are a lot more Uzbeks than Kyrgyz. This is not good. And finally, creating the problem, as I mentioned. There's a tendency to not distinguish between a person who holds very strong religious beliefs and a person who holds very strong religious beliefs and plans terrorist acts. And as people get put into jail, let's say justifiably, unjustifiably, these are large families, they're extended families. So if you're put in jail, then your brothers, your sisters, your cousins, your relations, all 80 of them, are going to know about it and they're going to be unhappy. And so for each person unjustly jailed, you multiply that by 80 of who knows and who has a view. And this, again, is something that can cause some problems. Next slide, please. Why do we care? I think I've kind of covered it. Stateless regions are a big problem. There are economic interests. Obviously, energy is critical to us. The more energy is exploited, the more that oil is flowing, the lower the prices are going to be, the better chances for economic growth for us and for the world. But also, and the thing that I find most important in what I'm doing is we actually stand for principles. And the issue of human rights and democracy, market economy, are ones that we support in our policy. And I can tell you that every day, that's what I do. We talk about free press, free speech, and we do something about it. We're just putting in a printing press and a media center. So papers that the government press won't print can get printed. And the Kyrgyz have agreed to this, which is interesting. Now, how much do we care? We didn't care too much before 9/11. Kyrgyz Republic, derivative interest. For us, if it went bad, that meant it might affect Kazakhstan, and then it might affect the oil. But really, there wasn't too much in it for us. Now, we understand that stateless regions and regions in turmoil are going to produce real dangers to our own country. And so it is certainly in our interest to pay a lot of attention and to assist in whatever way we can and to encourage the government to be responsible to its citizens. Next slide. So the future. Leaders, the president of Kyrgyzstan's the youngest. He's 58. He's actually quite healthy, and he said he's not going to run for president again in 2005. First one in Central Asia who will have a constitutional change of power, change of administration. The others are in their 60s. The Soviet tradition of many vodka toasts and certain inactivity is there. And so, you know, you don't know when these guys are going to go. But if they go, there's no party structure. There's no sure way of what the changeover is going to be. And so part of our assistance programs is trying to help build a press, a free and open press, but also to build some party structures that are not structured around personalities, but rather structured around issues. And there are not too many that are there. And the ones that are there are intellectual parties and have very small followings. Our strategy basically is threefold. economy, civil society, and security. That's what's going to bring stability. We try to build institutions, NGOs, and, very important, exchanges. And surprisingly enough, the best exchanges are high school students. Why? When they started this, I thought, high school students, you're wasting your money. You know, do Fulbrights, send the college students. No. High school students, first of all, are at that formative period in their lives where they really absorb a lot of the good things about our culture and our systems. The other thing is they come back because their parents won't let them stay. And so you don't have that other, they don't get married. So it's good. They come back and they are in the society again. And it's very, very effective. And we're just seeing the results of that. Next slide, please. So the conclusion, I would say, war in Afghanistan has made a difference. The IMU, which was the main bad guys in this region, Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, those are the ones who invaded twice. They are crippled, but they're not gone. Terrorism is slowed, but it's not stopped. And as I say to my Kyrgyz hosts, and to you, and to anybody who will listen, the bulwark against terrorism is a society that has confidence in its government. And right now, that level of confidence is not that high. It is partially because of problems of corruption, but also very poor tax base. And if you talk to someone back in the period of the Soviet Union, people live better. That's a fact. It's true. So they're looking back. Now they've got to start looking forward. So I want to, again, thank Dr. Bird and thank you for your attention. And I think I've left enough time for questions. I would welcome all easy questions.
The question is, how foolish is the Kyrgyz government to promote tourism?
When I'm talking about the whole issue of stability in the region, I mean, in a sense, it is a Chinese view. That is, it's not falling apart right now, but the seeds are there, and it's critical that they address those problems. And one of the ways to address the problem is to create employment. So if you remember Golda Meir's joke about Moses wandering in the desert for 40 years and finding the only place that didn't have oil, the Kyrgyz also migrated from both Mongolia and southern Siberia, and they hit the only place in the region that doesn't have gas or oil. So what they do have, as you see, is quite a beautiful country, and one way to create jobs is to promote tourism. And they do have some, and that has added to the GDP. I think you can do both things at the same time, do the economic development and also address these other quite serious issues.
Two questions. One is, what language do you use when you converse, and how many people can you talk to? And the second question is it appropriate to have a more socialistic-oriented government than ours in the circumstances in Kyrgyzstan?
The leadership in the country have pretty much all gone through Soviet university system. And so they're all Russian speaking, and so business is done in Russian, and I speak Russian. The state language is actually Kyrgyz. And when I go into the provinces, there are a lot of people who don't understand Russian very well, and I need an interpreter to do Kyrgyz English. So most of my discussions are in Russian. How many people do I talk to? I guess what I really wonder is how many people listen when I talk. I'll tell another short story. When I arrived in the country, my colleague, the German ambassador, said, John, this is a great country to be. He said, it's the last country when you can actually be an ambassador. He said, my home office, Berlin, doesn't pay any attention to what I'm doing. If I want something, a policy, I just cable them and they do it. I can talk to the president and the ministers anytime I want, and they actually pay attention to what I say. And he was exaggerating a little bit, but it is very pleasant to be able to engage with all levels of the government. But again, there are certain things that they take to heart and certain things that they nod and say yes and then do what they do.
Is there a program of American information dissemination in order to help achieve our various goals in the country?
Well, you probably saw, some of you saw the article in the Wall Street Journal on the front page about this program that the State Department put out. It's a television program of Muslims in America, and some countries have objected to it. It's been withdrawn. We, in fact, didn't use it because when we deployed, one of the things we were very worried about was popular reaction. And again, when I talked to the government, to the head of the National Security Council, I said, okay, how do you want to do the public relations? I said, you want an open base, a closed base? You want us to talk about it, not talk about it, because it's their country? And he said, no. I want it open. I want people to see it, because if you don't do it, then you'll just get rumors and a lot of bad information. So we did that. But the other thing was, this was in the North, and people in the North, they kind of knew what was doing. Half the population's in the South. That's the conservative area. That's where more fundamentalist, how should I say, the Muslim population there is much more observant, fewer drink and things like that. And when we look to see how do you get a message across, people don't have enough money for television. And they get their information through the radio and in the bazaars through rumors. And so we geared our information. And basically, it wasn't like we were spinning a story. We were just trying to get facts, because there's so many misconceptions. We just wanted to get facts. And that's what we're doing. Facts on the radio. And then we would send people down to talk and to kind of move it around. And thank goodness we just got our Peace Corps volunteers back. They were gone for a year. And I tell you, the power of the Peace Corps volunteers, because they're in the villages and they're in the small towns and they're in the schools, is incredible. It's such goodwill. You can't believe what an effect they have.
Would you comment upon the use of water both as a source of power and as a source of political power, negotiating power?
Yes, it's absolutely correct. The water for the 5 countries come from 2 countries, the poorest and the most resource poor, Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. And Kyrgyzstan has the northern route and Tajikistan the southern. Here, let me give you a real practical example. The Kyrgyz need Uzbek gas in the winter to heat houses in the north mostly. And the Uzbeks need Kyrgyz water in the spring and summer for their cotton crop. And the Kazakhs do as well. So what happens? They get this deal where the Kyrgyz will give X amount of water for X amount of gas, but they use more gas that's in the deal and they don't pay their bill. So the Uzbeks, at this time last year, when it was even colder than it is today, it was, let's see, minus 10 centigrade. It was about 15 degrees going down to 0. They picked the coldest spell and they turned the gas off, and they turned it off for 3 weeks. So what did the Kyrgyz do? They opened the turbines up in the dam that held all the water that the Uzbeks needed for the summer, because they needed electricity, because people started plugging their space heaters in. So, you know, when I talked about win-win, lose-lose, I mean, here is such a win-win situation and they can't figure it out. And I'll give you another example. The Kazakhs, who have a lot of money, they don't have a dog in this fight, except they want the water in the summer too. And so because they have a lot of money, they decided to spend, I think it was about $100 million to build this giant reservoir sort of in the desert, because they can never depend on the Kyrgyz to let the water go at the right time. And now, if the Kazakhs put 180 million into an unfinished dam, that dam can produce power in the winter because it's upstream from where the big reservoir is, and the water stays in the reservoir, and the Kazakhs get their water in the summer. And so now the World Bank and IMF and everybody else is trying to broker the deal with the Kyrgyz and the Kazakhs to do a big energy project. So we'll see how it happens. But at least they're working on it. At least they're working on it. And this year, the Uzbeks haven't cut the gas off yet.
Can you describe their long-term economic strategy?
Yeah, their economic strategy has targeted 4 areas. One is hydropower. Second is mining. They have gold and uranium, some coal, but coal's not too easily exploitable. They want to, like everyone else, they want to get into high tech and tourism. So those are the 4 areas that they would like to get into. I mean, their big problem is that their debt burden is so high. Their total debt burden with the World Bank debts and the IMF debts is more than their GDP. It's over 1.5 billion. And so they are restricted to, and I don't want to get too technical here, but they're supposed to be restricted to about 6% of their GDP can be sovereign debt that they assume to do projects. And to get economic growth, according to World Bank economists, you need about 18 to 20%. And they're not going to get any foreign capital in because there's a high degree of risk. And the risk is not, it's not political risk in terms of terrorism. The risk is that the government can be pretty arbitrary about how they deal with businesses.
The question is, what is the proportion of Slavics in the area now, or Slavs, rather?
It's about 12%, and it's dropping. There are more economic opportunities in Russia for both Kyrgyz and Russians, but Russians obviously have a somewhat easier time of assimilating and have a better chance of assuming Russian citizenship than Kyrgyz do. So it is dropping, and that's one of the problems that the government faces, because the government wishes to retain the Russian population. I'd mentioned that it's the only country in the region which has Russian as an official language. Kyrgyz is the state language, Russian is an official language, and most of the documents are in Russian.
The general question is, why are the terrorists in Kyrgyzstan?
And it was whether I equated fundamentalism with terrorism, and obviously not. And as I mentioned before, one of the problems is that some governments in the region, not in Kyrgyzstan, but some in the region, do not carefully distinguish between someone who's a very observant Muslim and someone who's a terrorism. And simply put, you don't prosecute someone for what they believe, you prosecute them for what they do. Now, the objectives of the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan is that they want to establish a Islamic caliphate in the Fergana Valley and surrounding regions, which would be under Sharia law. And that's what they want to do.
The question is there a mechanism for bringing high school students over?
Yes, there is. We have a program where we have a test countrywide, and we send about 40 a year to the U.S., and they go in all different states, all different places, all different size schools and towns and cities. We're a little worried about funding for this year because OMB has moved the funding from what was a program designed for former Soviet Union and Central Europe, and they've kind of put it into a big pot. So it can go for any region right now, which is, you can understand from a policy standpoint why you might want to do it. But my own parochial view is that these are countries, especially the former Soviet Union, they're 11 years old, and you can see they're still in transition. And you can also see that it's critical that you catch the next generation, because a lot of the current generation is, well, they're used to the old style. And what you hope is that you can develop leaders for the next generation.
Is there organized crime?
It's not at the level that you would find in let's say, in Russia. There's some organized crime, and there's a lot of drugs that get moved through, especially through the southern part, through Osh. It's the main route out of Afghanistan up through Tajikistan to Osh, and then to Russia and Siberia, and some to Europe. Not much goes to the U.S. And it's really hard to pin down who's controlling the flow. Some people will say that a lot of it is controlled by the terrorist organizations, and certainly back when the Taliban was in Afghanistan, yes, absolutely. It's less clear now who's doing the drugs.
Is there more than backpacking for tourists?
Yes. It is a great place for trekking, either backpacking or on horses. And if you do, I see a lot of Germans who come, who are horse people, and what they do is they get a horse, and that's all they have, because they have like 5 or 6 guys with the yurts that they wrap up and they put on the other horse, and they cook all the meals. And so all you do is ride your horse, and you sit down, and they fix your meal, and they tuck you in bed. So it's outdoorsy, and, it's up in the mountains. It's way up, 9,000 feet. But it's beautiful. They have a Hyatt hotel, 5-star hotel. They have some skiing, not great. The mountains right by the capital are 15,000 feet, and then the ones out in the west are 21, 22, or out in the east towards China. It's not too well developed, frankly. If you go there, you can have a certain amount of comfort, especially in Bishkek. But once you get outside of Bishkek, it's not the standard you might be used to. But it's quite incredible. I think the best thing about it is that, in a sense, the people are still very, very warm and very friendly, and very interesting.
Is it possible that the debt might be forgiven, at least in part?
I think there'll be a real push. As I said, this program is about a 3.5-year program, and at the end of that, I think there's going to be a very strong push to do Naples terms or something equivalent. That was sort of what was talked about, but then they couldn't get agreement. I think they might have come around to it. The real problem, in a sense, that Russia might have is that while they might be willing to do it for the Kyrgyz, they're holding a lot of debt with Armenia, Georgia, Tajikistan, and some of the other countries. And the other thing is kind of curious. When this debt was assumed in 91 and 92, countries like Uzbekistan said, we don't recognize it as debt. And so the international community doesn't recognize it as debt. So it was only the countries that said, yes, we'll do it. And if you look the ones that got it, they tend to be the smaller countries that didn't have enough power, frankly, to be able to say no.
How well do you live, and how big is your staff?
I live really well, thank you. Obviously, if you're in a country like this, there's the electricity doesn't work all the time, and you can't drink the water. Actually, so we distill the water, but I can't get a crab cake. I'm sorry. I'm really sorry about that. But you can get vegetables year-round. The fruits are great in season, and summer is wonderful. And there are a lot of restaurants: Italian, Chinese, Italian, Chinese, Japanese, Turkish, Lebanese. So that's pretty good. The staff is there's about 45 Americans. 6 of those are Marine security guards, and the rest are. We have a couple people in our defense attaché office, a number of political and economic officers, an aid mission there, and we're pretty much engaged with the assistance programs and security programs. That really takes up most of our time. And sort of being the go-between between the base and the government to make sure there's no friction and that problems that really aren't problems don't become problems, because that's usually, it's inattention that usually causes difficulties.
The question was, what did we promise their government in return for the use of their bases or airport?
This is very interesting. I mentioned the two conversations, and obviously I had other conversations with the president. And at no time did he or the defense minister or the head of their National Security Council ever say, we want something. All they did was offer. It really was very touching. Now, we did have an assistance program of about $40 million a year. And one of the things that they said to me was, well, you know, you've helped us all these years. Now it's our turn to help you.
What is the American economic input into the country?
Well, in terms of actual assistance programs, it's about $40 million a year. It varies from year to year. In economic activity, there's very little exchange between us. We calculated what the base spends locally, and if you take out the fuel, which is, even though it's purchased from a local company, a Kyrgyz company, it's all brought in from Kazakhstan. So if you take that part out, we spend about 22 to 25 million in support of the coalition base out there.
What is the literacy rate?
Literacy rate's about 99%. And what it is, it's a legacy of the Soviet Union. I'm serious, the Soviet education system, you can see it. It got into every village, every town. Now what's happening is that the kids, especially again in the South where the families are fairly big, they'll have 8, 7, the kids have to work in the fields, so they work all through the harvest, which goes through end of September, October. And we also find that some families keep their children out of school because they don't have shoes. And some of this, especially with refugee families from Afghanistan and Tajikistan. And so we have a program where we give UN Commissioner for High Commissioner for Refugees money to buy clothing for the kids so they can get into school.
Well, I think this has been an extraordinarily informative evening. It's been a lot of fun. It's been very informative. We appreciate the time that the ambassador has shared so generously with us. On behalf of all of us, thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador.